Yeah. Well, it looks very nice.
So today we're going to be teaching you guys how to build a computer. For this project, you're really only going to need the standard Phillips head screwdriver, but I find having a more comprehensive screwdriver set on hand is definitely a big plus in case you have issues with your case or what have you down the road. This computer represents a high-end gaming computer, meaning we're not really pulling any punches when it comes to any of our parts, but we're also not overspending on ridiculous, 6950Xs with like 10 cores and 20 threads and, spending $5 on a computer just because we can. For this computer, we are using an EVGA GeForce GTX 1070 RGB Edition graphics card. We are using, for storage, we have a WD Blue 2TB hard drive, slightly less performance than the WD Black or WD Red, but definitely the better bang for the buck. For CPU cooling, we could use the, kind of craptastic, yeah, it's not terrible, but it's not great, and they're really loud, and they're super inefficient, and they're kind of terrible, bundled in a box Intel coolers. However, I decided to go for the Hyper 212 Evo because they're only about $25, and I really do think that if you're building a $1,200 computer, you should probably be investing in making it kind of as quiet as possible, even if you don't intend to overclock. Which brings me into my next segment, the CPU. We are using a Core i5-6400 non-K SKU. We are not using a K SKU because the person that I'm building this computer for doesn't really want to get into CPU overclocking because this is mostly a gaming computer with light video editing here and there. For our RAM, we are using 2 sticks of 8GB Corsair DDR4 Vengeance LPX RAM. For our motherboard, this wonderful piece of sexy kit right here, we are using the MSI Z270 SLIM Crossfire Ready motherboard. Definitely a very nice motherboard and at a decent price. I believe this was about $150, $160, whereas I'm one of those people that I like to spend about that for a motherboard. I don't really believe in spending $400 for an Asus Rampage Extreme because I think they're insane. Because they are. And I think even Asus will admit that. For our power supply, we are going with the Corsair. We have kind of a Corsair theme going for this build. Not that we were trying, but, We have an RM750X power supply. It is a fully modular power supply, and I believe you are 80 plus silver efficient, if not 80 plus bronze. And, oh, right, the case. The case is a Corsair Carbide 100R. We're not going to be water cooling, but this case definitely has room for that later on, so hope you guys enjoy the ride, so let's get started. And cut. Okay, so we're going to show you guys how to install RAM. It's pretty brain dead easy. Just match up the keyed slot on the RAM stick up with the slot in the motherboard, so right there. You're going to push it in, push it until you hear that click. You're going to want to leave these open so they can click shut. And we're going to do it for the second one. I usually leave the outer ones unpopulated just for sakes of, there you go, just for sakes of aesthetics, but using the further two away does increase airflow and can increase and decrease CPU temperatures. So, next we're going to show you guys how to install an Intel CPU. It's pretty easy. You're just going to match this gold triangle with this notched triangle in the hold down bracket. You're going to pull back the hold down bracket, drop the CPU in. It's keyed so it'll only go in one way. It has 2 notches on either side up here. You're going to push the hold down bracket into place and then push, and notch it in. If you hear a little crunching, you're probably fine. It's just the pins making contact with the LGA pads. Okay, so now we're going to show you guys how to put on an aftermarket CPU cooler. Keep in mind this is not universal, and it's definitely going to be not universally the case with all CPU coolers, particularly liquid coolers, which are much more complex. But showing you guys how to put on thermal compound is the first step, so we're just going to do my personal favorite method, the P. Although it honestly doesn't matter, just try not to use too little because that will not aid in thermal contact between your CPU and your aftermarket cooler. And don't put too much because it can squish on the outsides and it just creates a giant mess, and if it gets in the CPU socket, no one's going to be happy. So we're just going to put a P-shaped, not pea-sized amount, and that's plenty. Generally, the rule of thumb with thermal compound is less is more, but you definitely don't want to be using too little, otherwise you're going to have severe issues with, again, thermal transfer. I've seen systems with far too little thermal compound, and I've seen ones without any thermal compound at all, and the temperatures can get pretty rough after only a few hours. Okay, so we've mounted up the screws, and after some fiddling, we finally got it to work correctly. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to tighten these in a cross pattern so you don't apply any pressure to your CPU too much in one way or the other. You should get it fairly tight, but try not to make it so your board's flexing and it's creaking and it sounds like it's gonna rip itself apart. But just tight enough that you're certain that it's making good contact with your thermal material. And always going across pattern, just so we don't stress the CPU out too much. And yeah, that's gonna about do it. So to put the fan back on, it's a fairly simple mounting system. You're just gonna kind of snap it back in place. And there we go. We're just gonna route the cable around the back here, and you're gonna plug it into your CPU header, which is usually just about here on your motherboard. If not, it'll be right around the CPU socket. It'll always say CPU fan 1 on it. Some more fancier boards have water blocks and things like that allow you to control pump speeds, but this is not one of those boards, and I think those boards are a little bit nuts. So yeah, moving right along. Okay, so from right here we have our front panel headers, which include power and reset, hard drive LEDs, and our reset buttons, and our USB 3.0 and our USB 2.0 headers. So these are keyed. These will only go in one way, so if it's not working, just swap them around. Same thing with our little tiny connectors here. If you have any issues with these, just swap them around. It won't hurt them if you put them in wrong, so don't be afraid to just give it a couple tries. So here's the pièce de résistance, the GeForce GTX 1070 graphics card. This bad boy has an RGB controller on it, so we can change these lighting zones if we like. It has two 120mm fans, runs off PCI Express 3.0, has SLI fingers if you want to run multiple cards. And here's how to install it. You're going to start by removing these slotted brackets right here from your computer. Every computer's different, some of them you just yank off. This one actually had this weird locking mechanism that we had to use, so from there you're going to pop this tab right here. Unlock it, take the graphics card, and you're going to lower it into the case. Make sure you line up the PCI Express slot, and you can actually see it right there. And you're just gonna push gently until you hear it click. From there, you're going to screw in the PCI Express lock, which is just on the other side here. When it decides to cooperate. I'm gonna go to my doctor later, and he's gonna want to murder me because my back is gonna be messed up. Connor, what have you been doing for the last 9 hours? You really don't want to know. We'll be right back. Okay, so we finally got them in. Turns out they're just a little bit tight out of the factory, so yay! But we are just about done. And we have this extra step of putting this PCI bracket back in. I've never seen this before, so you're unlikely to run into it in the wild, but if you do, it's just a couple of screws, which I'm expecting to be harder than obsidian to screw in, but nope, these are actually relatively easy. I'm starting to think that that one screw might have just hated me. And where did the other screw go? Okay, so from right here we have our front panel headers, which include power and reset, hard drive LEDs, and our reset buttons, and our USB 3.0 and our USB 2.0 headers. So these are keyed. These will only go in one way, so if it's not working, just swap them around. Same thing with our little tiny connectors here. If you have any issues with these, just swap them around. It won't hurt them if you put them in wrong, so don't be afraid to just give it a couple tries. Alright, so this is our finished product. As you can see, it's a little bare on the inside, but keep in mind this project was all about expandability. So we can add more hard drives, we can add disk drives, we can even add like a full closed water loop if we really wanted to, with like radiators, pumps, places for reservoirs. You know, kind of the sky's the limit here. So what you've seen us do is install the hardware. What you didn't see us do is really cable manage. Cable management is going to be very personal from case to case, and it's also going to depend on your tolerance for kind of clutter within your case. We have a side panel on this one, so we wanted it to look as clean as we could get it. If you don't have a side panel, you know, it's much less important to have your cables. I mean, don't get me wrong, don't just like shove it in there and have a rat's nest, because that'll affect your cooling, and it can interfere with your fans, which will burn them out. So, as you can see, we still have the 1070 in there. We wound up going with the vertical mount on our CPU cooler, and on the back here, you can actually see that I've actually plugged up all of our extraneous little things here. This actually came with the 1070, so I can't take full credit, but I did pull out the HDMI one and stuck it in here just so, you know, there's no confusion and no one plugs their HDMI into the video out on the CPU rather than the graphics card, try to play Borderlands the pre-sequel and wonder, why am I getting 3 FPS? You laugh, I had someone do that. God, that was fun. Moving away from my grandparents, we're just about done, so we're going to show you guys some glam footage, and we're going to move on to some benchmarks. So our last step is going to be to put on these side panels. This is by far the easiest part of the build. So your side panels have thumb screws. It's pretty easy. They're pretty, you know, brain dead easy to put in. You just look for the thread on the side, and you just put them right back in. And there we have our computer. So next step is to install Windows. So let's get this bad boy plugged in.